Paul Miller never thought of himself as the paranoid type. He was a systems analyst, the kind of man who trusted spreadsheets more than gut feelings, who believed every problem had a logical pattern waiting to be uncovered. But lately, his wife Sandra's work dinners had begun stacking up like unpaid bills, too frequent, too convenient, and too poorly explained. At first, he brushed it off. After all, Sandra was ambitious. She'd worked her way up in marketing, always chasing connections, chasing opportunities. Networking was part of the game, she reminded him. And Paul tried to believe her. Tried. But as the weeks turned into months, something about her excuses started to ring hollow. He noticed the little changes first. The way she carried her phone like it was an extra limb, never letting it out of sight. The way she typed out quick messages and tilted the screen away if he happened to glance in her direction. She used to leave her phone face up on the counter while they cooked dinner together. Now it stayed glued to her hand, even when she went to the bathroom. Then came the nights. One dinner a week turned into 2, then 3. "The team needs me," she'd say with a distracted kiss on his cheek. Or, "Big client meeting, don't wait up." And Paul, logical, patient Paul, told himself he shouldn't be suspicious. This was just how successful careers worked, right? Long hours, late nights, sacrifices. But when she started stumbling through the door past midnight, her blouse slightly rumpled, her hair not quite the way it was when she left, he couldn't ignore the knot tightening in his chest. The smell was the worst of it. A faint trace of cologne lingered on her clothes, not his, never his. Paul wore the same clean, mild scent he had for years. This was different, sharper, musky, unfamiliar. He'd sit up in bed when she slid under the covers, pretending to be half asleep, and that smell would hit him like a slap. She'd turn her back to him, mutter, "It's late, can we not do this now," whenever he tried to ask questions. And so he stopped asking. On the outside, he played the role of the steady husband, calm, supportive, unshaken. But inside, the analyst in him had already started building a case. He couldn't help it. Every inconsistency, every unexplained gap in her schedule, every nervous smile was a data point. And data, unlike emotions, didn't lie. Sandra, of course, noticed his distance. She grew sharper with him, more defensive. When he asked harmless questions like, "How was the dinner?" she'd snap, "It's work, Paul. Do I need to give you a play-by-play?" The woman who once used to call him on her way home, laughing about office gossip, no longer bothered to check in at all. Paul told himself maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he was just imagining patterns where none existed, like a coder stuck in an infinite loop. But each night she came home later than the last, each night her excuses got thinner, and each night that cologne clung to her clothes a little longer. And so, quietly, methodically, he began to pay attention. Not in an obvious way. Not by grilling her or snooping when she left her purse on the counter. He simply observed. He watched the way she smiled at her phone, a secret smile that wasn't meant for him. He noted the sudden silences when she stepped outside to take a call. He memorized the excuses, the timelines, the little cracks in the story she was trying to sell. To anyone else, Paul might have looked like a husband giving his wife space. But in reality, he was already investigating. Already gathering evidence the way he would for a compromised network, one vulnerability at a time. The dinners had started as a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing any couple might argue about and move past. But now, they had become something else entirely, a red flag waving in the quiet corridors of their marriage. And deep down, though he wouldn't admit it to himself yet, Paul already knew the truth. Paul Miller had always trusted patterns. In his world, nothing happened by accident. If a server crashed, it was because of a flaw in the code. If a firewall was breached, there was always a breadcrumb trail leading back to the vulnerability. And now, staring at the cracks forming in his marriage, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing the same kind of pattern play out, only this time, it wasn't software failing. It was Sandra. The little things were multiplying. When Sandra first started attending work dinners, she'd at least text him once or twice during the night. A picture of her drink, a line about how long the client was dragging out negotiations, a quick, "miss you," just to soften the blow of being gone so late. Those small gestures had kept Paul calm at first, reassured him that she was still thinking of him even while climbing her career ladder. But those texts had dried up. Weeks passed without a single message during her dinners. When she got home, she wouldn't even bother with excuses anymore. Just a distracted, "it's late, let's not fight," before disappearing into the bathroom to shower off the evening. And when she slid into bed, she was careful to face the wall, careful to avoid his searching eyes. Paul noticed, though. He noticed everything. The faint blush in her cheeks when she walked in the door. The hurried way she peeled off her jacket, tossed it onto the chair, and reached for her phone before anything else. He noticed how the phone never left her hand anymore. Not at dinner. Not when they watched TV. Not even when she brushed her teeth. It was as if she thought the device itself could shield her from him. The smell was still there, too. That unfamiliar cologne, sharp, masculine, persistent. Paul had tested himself one night, leaning in when she dropped her bag in the hallway. He closed his eyes, inhaled, and knew without a doubt that she had been somewhere she shouldn't have been. Someone else's space. Someone else's arms. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontations were messy. Emotional. And emotions lied. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't rely on feelings, they shifted too easily, too quickly. Data, on the other hand, was stable. Permanent. And so, Paul started cataloging. He kept mental notes of her departure times, her return times. He compared them to the calendar invites she sometimes left open on her laptop. They didn't match. He tracked the change in her wardrobe too, how she suddenly owned 3 new dresses, all more fitted than anything she'd worn before. How she started wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years. How her makeup, once minimal and practical, had turned more deliberate, more polished. One night, while she claimed to be at a late client dinner, Paul found himself staring at her half-empty wine glass on the kitchen counter. She had left in a rush, barely touching it. He ran his finger around the rim, the smudge of her lipstick still fresh. Something inside him twisted. Not rage, not yet, but the slow burn of inevitability. The analyst in him couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. If this were a system log, he would already know where the breach had occurred. He would already be drafting the incident report. But this wasn't a system. It was his marriage. Sandra returned that night past midnight, her heels clicking unevenly on the hardwood floor. Paul was still awake, sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, though he wasn't working. She walked in, startled to see him there. "You're up," she said quickly, her voice light but forced. "Yeah," he replied evenly, not looking up from the screen. "Couldn't sleep." She hesitated, clearly thrown off by his calmness. It was a long night. The client kept dragging things out. "You know how it is." Paul glanced at the clock. "Until midnight?" Sandra froze for half a second, then forced a smile. "You know how these things go." She brushed past him, her perfume sharp in the air, and disappeared down the hall. Paul closed the laptop. He hadn't typed a word. He didn't need to. He had all the confirmation he required, not in her words, but in the inconsistencies, the evasions, the patterns that didn't fit. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to her steady breathing beside him. His heart didn't race. His hands didn't shake. Instead, a strange calm settled over him. The kind of calm that came before making a critical decision in a crisis. Sandra thought she was keeping her secret safe. But Paul knew better. He could already see the shape of the truth forming, and soon, he'd have the data to prove it. Paul Miller had always believed in rules. Not the kind written into marriage vows or scribbled onto sticky notes on the fridge, but the invisible ones, rules of logic, consistency, structure. He spent his career studying them. As a systems analyst, he could stare at pages of code or network activity and find the flaw most people overlooked. A misplaced bracket, a gap in a security protocol, a data stream that didn't quite align. Every problem had a cause, and every cause left evidence. So when Sandra's behavior began to spiral further out of alignment, Paul did what came naturally: he framed it as a system failure. It was easier that way. Easier than calling it betrayal. Easier than allowing himself to think the woman he'd built a life with was choosing someone else. To Paul, feelings were noisy variables, messy, misleading, unreliable. Data, on the other hand, was clean. Precise. Honest. He sat at his desk late one night, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across the living room. Sandra was out, dinner with the team, she had said, tossing the words over her shoulder as though they were nothing. Paul stared at the blank screen-saver, his reflection staring back at him, and thought about bugs. In his line of work, bugs didn't announce themselves with flashing red lights. They crept in quietly. They hid in plain sight. A single typo in thousands of lines of code could bring down an entire system. If you weren't vigilant, if you weren't methodical, you'd miss it. And wasn't that what was happening here? A bug in his marriage. A vulnerability. Something corrupting what used to be seamless. Paul's jaw tightened. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Not the late nights. Not the silences. Not the phone she guarded like it contained state secrets. He felt the decision settle in his chest with the weight of inevitability. He was going to treat this like any other problem. Collect data. Trace patterns. Confirm the root cause. That thought, strangely, calmed him. For weeks, he had been wrestling with uncertainty. Was he paranoid, or was Sandra really slipping away? But uncertainty was just uncollected evidence. And evidence, once gathered, left no room for doubt. He opened a notepad on his computer and began writing. Not accusations, not diary entries, logs. Like he would for a client system. March 3rd, out at work dinner. Left 6:45 p.m. returned 12:21 a.m. No explanation for 5+ hour gap. March 6th, phone locked, face down during dinner. Smiled at screen multiple times. Declined call when I entered kitchen. March 9th, new dress, unfamiliar perfume. Claimed, client presentation. Return time, 1:10 a.m. strong cologne smell on jacket. Each note was clinical, detached. Each one stripped of emotion, just data points stacking into a story. By the time the list filled 2 pages, Paul felt something shift inside him. Not anger. Not despair. Vindication. If Sandra thought she was clever, thought she could gaslight him with her practiced smiles and sharp deflections, she was wrong. He had spent his entire career seeing through illusions, catching vulnerabilities no one else could. She was just another system with a weakness, and he was already mapping it out. That night, lying in bed while Sandra pretended to be asleep, Paul stared at the ceiling and made a quiet vow. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't even confront her until the time was right. He would gather everything, every message, every location ping, every late-night lie, and then he'd decide how to handle the breach. Sandra shifted beside him, her back turned as always, her breathing steady. Paul almost smiled. She thought she was safe. She thought she was in control. But she didn't know who she was married to. Paul Miller wasn't just a husband. He was an analyst. A man who trusted proof over promises. And sooner or later, he would have all the proof he needed. The night Paul finally crossed the line, it felt less like a decision and more like a natural step in the process. Like debugging a program, you didn't stop at suspicion, you dug until you found the flaw. Sandra had left for yet another networking dinner. She breezed out the door in a navy dress Paul had never seen before, her hair done in soft waves that didn't match the story she told him about meeting with a client over burgers. He had watched her slip into the car without a backward glance, the taillights fading into the darkness, and for the first time in months, Paul felt calm. Because tonight, he was done waiting. He moved to his desk with the same focus he brought to penetration testing for clients. His laptop hummed to life, screen washing his face in pale light. Normally, when he worked, he built walls, firewalls, defenses, safety nets. Tonight, he was building the opposite, a way in. Paul wasn't a hacker in the Hollywood sense. He didn't smash keyboards or run flashy code with green text raining down the screen. No, he was methodical. Quiet. He knew exactly what he needed, monitoring software. Lightweight, invisible, efficient. Something that would send him the data without Sandra ever knowing it existed. It took less than 10 minutes. That fact alone almost unnerved him. How easy it was. How vulnerable people left themselves when they thought no one was looking. Sandra, for instance, had never changed her phone's backup password. It was still the same one she'd chosen years ago, her childhood dog's name and their wedding anniversary. Paul entered it in without hesitation, the keystrokes almost mocking in their simplicity. The program slid into her phone like a ghost. No alerts, no flashing icons, nothing she'd notice. It was designed to live in the background, to collect everything, texts, call logs, locations, photos. All of it would quietly funnel to Paul's inbox. For a brief moment, as he clicked install, Paul felt a flicker of guilt. Marriage was supposed to be about trust. He knew this wasn't trust. This was surveillance. A violation. But the guilt didn't last long. Sandra had been violating their marriage for months, maybe longer. He was just evening the playing field. And besides, wasn't this exactly what he did every day? His clients hired him to find weak spots, to monitor, to test, to confirm. Why should his own life be any different? When the confirmation window popped up, installation complete, Paul leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving him like pressure from a valve. He had done it. He was in. He closed the laptop, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. He stood there in the stillness, feeling the enormity of what he'd just done. He had crossed a line. And he was fine with it. Later that night, while Sandra was still out, Paul's phone buzzed. A new email. Subject line, sync report, device data updated. His pulse quickened. He opened it. There, neatly formatted, was a log of her messages. Texts to coworkers, group chats from old college friends, and then, his eyes caught on it, one thread that stood out. The name at the top, Jason Benson. The first few messages looked harmless, casual even. Jason asking how her dinner was going. Sandra replying with emojis and quick phrases. But then, as Paul scrolled, the tone shifted. Jason wishing he could see her. Sandra replying with flirty banter. Winky faces, double meanings, promises between the lines. And then, the smoking gun. Jason, see you at 7 at my place. You know where the key is. Can't wait winking face. Paul stared at the screen. Not with rage. Not with heartbreak. But with the same detached fascination he felt when catching a vulnerability in a client's system. Everything fit now. The late nights. The perfume. The cologne he didn't own. All of it slid neatly into place like puzzle pieces snapping together. And oddly enough, the certainty was comforting. No more doubts. No more wondering if he was imagining things. His gut hadn't lied. The data hadn't lied. Sandra had. Paul closed the email and shut off his laptop. He felt no urge to confront her that night. No need to rehearse angry speeches or storm out into the night. Instead, he went upstairs, brushed his teeth, and slid into bed. When Sandra finally stumbled in, whispering excuses under her breath, Paul pretended to be asleep. His breathing steady, his body still. She climbed under the covers beside him, oblivious to the fact that her carefully constructed facade had already crumbled. Paul lay awake, his mind clear. For the first time in months, he felt like he was in control again. He didn't need a confession. He didn't need tears or drama. He had the evidence. And soon, Sandra would know just how dangerous it was to underestimate a man who trusted data more than promises. The morning after Paul installed the spyware felt strangely ordinary. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, Sandra hummed in the kitchen while making coffee, and the smell of toasted bagels filled the house. To anyone else, it looked like a picture-perfect Saturday morning. But to Paul, it was a simulation, an illusion crafted by a woman who had no idea her double life was already unraveling. He watched her move around the kitchen in her robe, barefoot, smiling casually as she asked if he wanted cream cheese. Paul studied her like an actor on stage. Every gesture, every word, every smile, it all seemed rehearsed. And the knowledge burned quietly inside him, he knew where she had really been last night. He knew whose arms she had been in. Sandra placed a mug in front of him, kissed the top of his head, and drifted back toward the counter. Paul didn't flinch. He sipped the coffee, his eyes on the steam curling upward, hiding the fact that his phone, face down on the table, was already buzzing with new reports from the spyware. He waited until she went upstairs to shower before flipping the phone over. A new subject line blinked at him, daily sync, 312 messages, 12 photos, 4 calls logged. He opened it. The screen filled with evidence. There were texts from Jason, growing bolder and more intimate. Photos, grainy, low-light selfies of Sandra in that same navy dress, her lips puckered in mock kisses toward the camera. Voice notes from Jason, his tone casual but unmistakably possessive, saying things like, "Miss you already, babe. Next weekend can't come soon enough." And then, the detail that sealed everything. Location data. The spyware tracked her GPS in real time, pinning her phone to an apartment complex on the other side of town. Timestamped exactly during the hours she claimed she was at a client dinner. Paul's stomach didn't drop. His pulse didn't spike. Instead, he felt the calm, sharp focus of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Every shred of doubt had been removed. Every variable accounted for. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was fact. He closed the phone and sat back in his chair, letting the quiet satisfaction wash over him. He had proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. Proof that could shatter Sandra's lies in a single breath. But instead of anger, what surprised him was strategy. Paul wasn't the kind of man who confronted problems impulsively. He was a planner, a tactician. And now that he had the truth, the question wasn't if he would expose her, but how. He pictured scenarios like chess moves. Option 1, confront her immediately. Throw the texts and photos on the table and demand an explanation. The dramatic choice. But that gave her power, gave her room to cry, deny, manipulate. Option 2, go silent. Collect more data. Build a timeline so airtight it could withstand any excuse she tried to spin. That would be thorough, but it also meant living alongside the lie for longer. Option 3, wait until she least expected it. Drop the proof in a way that turned the tables, that stripped her of control and left her exposed. Paul leaned toward option 3. Later that day, Sandra bustled around the house, chattering about brunch plans with coworkers. Paul nodded at the right moments, even smiled when she kissed his cheek before heading out. But the moment her car disappeared down the street, he opened his laptop. He began creating a private folder, labeling it simply, Sandra, Evidence. Inside, he organized everything, screenshots of texts, call logs, photos, GPS routes. He added timestamps, annotations, even cross-referenced receipts from their joint bank account with her lies about work dinners. It was meticulous, clinical, the way he documented vulnerabilities for his clients. By the time Sandra returned that evening, Paul had compiled a digital dossier that read like a case file. Not speculation. Not suspicion. Hard data. And then he had an idea, cold, calculated, almost elegant in its cruelty. Instead of shouting, instead of fighting, he would let the truth speak for itself. He would pick the right moment, the perfect moment, and present Sandra with her own double life as if it were a mirror. No accusations. No arguments. Just facts she couldn't escape. That night, as she laughed at a sitcom beside him on the couch, Paul stole glances at her profile, her relaxed posture, her easy smile. She had no idea her carefully built world was already collapsing. And Paul, for the first time in months, felt powerful again. He didn't need to rush. He had the proof. And soon, Sandra would discover just how devastating it felt to be outplayed by someone who knew every one of her secrets before she even spoke. Paul had proof. Undeniable, concrete, airtight. And yet, he knew better than to waste it on a hasty confrontation. He'd seen enough courtroom dramas and read enough case studies in cybersecurity to understand, timing was everything. Drop the hammer too soon, and the target wriggled out. Wait too long, and the impact dulled. So Paul plotted. He didn't think of it as revenge, at least not at first. To him, it was architecture. Engineering. He was designing a trap so precise that when Sandra finally stepped into it, she wouldn't even realize what had happened until the walls closed in. The first step was patience. For the next week, Paul played his part flawlessly. He laughed at her jokes, nodded during her stories, made dinner when she came home late. He let her believe she was in control. He let her believe she was safe. Every time she lied, the client dinner ran late, I'm exhausted from all the networking, Paul simply nodded, hiding the fact that his phone buzzed quietly in his pocket with GPS pings from Jason's apartment. He smiled while she scrolled through texts at the dinner table, pretending to read work emails, when he already had copies of the very messages lighting up her screen. He was living in two realities now. In one, he was the dutiful husband, still fooled, still trusting. In the other, he was the observer, the hunter, the architect of her downfall. And with each passing day, Sandra dug herself deeper. Paul collected everything. Her excuses, her locations, her patterns. He even kept a physical notebook, jotting down dates and times like a detective. September 10th, 8:32 p.m. Sandra at Jason's, stayed overnight. September 14th, 7:45 p.m. Purchased wine, delivered to Jason's address. Every entry tightened the noose. But it wasn't enough just to gather proof. Paul wanted impact. He wanted a reveal so crushing, so inescapable, that Sandra couldn't spin it, couldn't escape it, couldn't even breathe through it. And that's when the idea came to him. Breakfast. It was so simple, almost poetic. Every morning, Sandra sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee, pretending to be a wife. What better stage to tear down the illusion than in the same place she built it? Paul pictured it in detail. Sandra sipping her coffee, smiling casually, unaware that the laptop on the table was already loaded with the folder he'd built. He would slide it toward her, open it with a single click, and let the truth cascade across the screen, texts, photos, locations, timestamps. Her entire betrayal, illuminated in the morning light, with nowhere to run. No shouting. No accusations. Just evidence. Just the raw, brutal reality staring her in the face. It was perfect. But Paul wasn't reckless. He knew he needed a backup plan. What if she tried to deny it anyway? What if she stormed out, played the victim, twisted the narrative? So he created redundancies. He uploaded the folder to a cloud drive under a private account. He printed select screenshots and locked them in a file in his desk. He even sent an encrypted copy to his work email, disguised as client report draft. If Sandra destroyed one set, 3 more existed. She wouldn't escape. As the plan crystallized, Paul noticed something interesting happening inside himself. He wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way he'd expected. Instead, he felt sharp, alive, almost exhilarated. Each lie she told him was like another move in a game of chess where he was already 10 steps ahead. Each smile she flashed felt hollow, but instead of hurting, it fueled him. He wasn't the betrayed husband anymore. He was the man behind the curtain. And Sandra was walking blindly into his trap. The night before the reveal, Paul watched her leave again, dressed in a black blouse and heels. She kissed him on the cheek, smelling of perfume that wasn't for him, and chirped, "Don't wait up." Paul smiled warmly, as if nothing were wrong. When the door shut, he turned back to his laptop, reviewing the folder one last time. It was immaculate. Everything in order. Every detail accounted for. It wasn't just proof anymore. It was a masterpiece. By the time Sandra returned, he was already in bed, steady breathing mimicking sleep. She slipped in beside him, humming softly to herself, still clueless that tomorrow morning her entire life would be turned inside out. Paul lay awake, staring into the dark, calm and deliberate. Tomorrow wasn't about rage. Tomorrow was about truth. About control. About showing Sandra that she had underestimated the wrong man. He closed his eyes and finally let sleep take him, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. Because the trap was ready. And in just a few hours, Sandra would walk right into it. The smell of coffee drifted through the kitchen, mingling with the buttery sweetness of pancakes sizzling on the skillet. Paul moved with calm precision, whisking, pouring, flipping, as though this were just another ordinary morning. But inside, he felt the quiet hum of anticipation, the sharpened focus of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind. Today wasn't ordinary. Today was the day Sandra's lies ran out of road. By the time Sandra padded downstairs, her hair still tousled from sleep, the table was set. A neat stack of pancakes, syrup glistening in a glass jar, fresh orange juice in tall glasses. She stopped at the foot of the stairs, blinking in surprise. "Wow," she said, forcing a light laugh. "This is new." Paul turned, spatula in hand, and offered her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Figured it's been a while since we had breakfast together. Thought it might be nice." Sandra hesitated, scanning his face for clues, as if some instinct whispered that something was off. But then she slid into her seat, reaching for the syrup. "Well, thanks. This looks great." They ate in silence at first. Paul asked simple questions about her plans for the day. Sandra responded with short, careful answers, her voice overly casual, the way someone sounds when they're trying not to give themselves away. Her phone sat on the table next to her hand, screen down, like a lifeline she didn't dare let out of reach. Paul studied her the way a scientist observes an experiment. Every flicker of her eyes, every fidget of her fingers, every pause before answering. Finally, when her plate was nearly empty, Paul leaned back, took a slow sip of coffee, and set the mug down with deliberate calm. "So," he said softly, "how's Jason?" The fork in Sandra's hand froze midair. For a heartbeat, the kitchen was utterly silent, save for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, wide with shock, then quickly narrowed into confusion. "Jason," she repeated, her voice a half-octave higher than usual. "Who's Jason?" Paul tilted his head, feigning casual amusement. "The guy you've been seeing after work. The one who thinks he's clever hiding a spare key under his doormat." Sandra's face drained of color, then flushed hot. Her lips parted, searching for words, but nothing came. "I've seen the texts," Paul continued, his tone calm, almost conversational. "The late-night meetups. The "can't wait to see you" messages. The locations. All of it. Sandra set her fork down with a clatter. She stammered, her voice breaking. You went through my phone. Paul gave a small shrug, cutting another bite of pancake as if they were discussing the weather. Not exactly. Let's just say I have my ways. Comes with the territory when you're a systems analyst. Weak security leaves openings, Sam. And you? You were full of them. Her jaw clenched. Anger sparked in her eyes, but beneath it, panic flickered. That's an invasion of privacy, she snapped, trying to regain control, to flip the script. Paul chuckled, the sound dry and cold. Privacy. Cute word, coming from someone sneaking around in another man's apartment while lying to her husband. Sandra's hands trembled slightly as she pushed her plate away. Maybe if you weren't glued to your laptop all the time, maybe if you actually paid attention to me, this wouldn't have happened. Paul leaned forward, his smile thin and sharp. Oh, I paid attention, Sam. More than you think. I noticed every late night, every excuse, every whiff of cologne that wasn't mine. You underestimated me because you thought I was too quiet, too trusting. But the thing about trust? He tapped his finger against the table, slow and deliberate. Once it's gone, all that's left is data. And the data doesn't lie. Sandra's eyes glistened with the beginnings of tears. Paul, please. It's not what you think. I made a mistake, but it's not. Don't insult me, Paul cut in, his voice low but razor sharp. I have months' worth of proof. This isn't a mistake, it's a pattern. And patterns don't break overnight. Her breath hitched, a sound between a sob and a gasp. So what, you're just going to throw everything away? Years of marriage, just like that? Paul leaned back again, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable. I'm not throwing anything away, Sam. You already did. I'm just cleaning up the mess. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sandra sat stiff in her chair, her eyes darting toward her phone like she wanted to grab it and run. Paul simply watched, calm and unflinching, letting the weight of the silence crush her. Finally, she broke. Paul, she whispered, voice trembling. Can we just talk this through? Please. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no warmth. Oh, we're talking. But this isn't a negotiation. You've got until tonight to pack your things. I'll be back at 8. If you're gone, fine. If not, he paused, his gaze cutting sharp as glass. I'll help you out the door myself. Sandra's mouth opened, then closed, her face a battlefield of disbelief, rage, and fear. For once, she had no words. Paul stood, collected his plate, and carried it to the sink. The sound of running water filled the room as if to signal the conversation was over. When he turned back, Sandra was still frozen at the table, her entire facade cracked wide open. Paul dried his hands on a towel, his voice calm, almost casual. Enjoy your pancakes. They'll be your last in this house. And with that, he walked out, leaving Sandra sitting in silence, staring at the crumbs of a life that had just shattered around her. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet street as Paul pulled his car into the driveway. He parked neatly, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment in the dimming light. His pulse was steady, his breathing calm. It wasn't nerves, no, those had burned away days ago. What remained was resolve, cold and absolute. At precisely 8 o'clock, just as he promised, Paul stepped inside the house. The moment the door closed behind him, he knew she hadn't left. Sandra's car was still parked outside, and now here she was, sitting on the couch in the living room, boxes scattered around her like props in a poorly rehearsed play. Her hair was messy, her eyes puffy, but she had arranged herself carefully, shoulders slouched just enough to look defeated, lips pressed together as though holding back tears. Vulnerability as performance art. Paul didn't sit. He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, gaze steady. "You're still here." Sandra looked up, her voice soft, almost whispery. "Paul, can we just talk for a minute?" He gestured with one hand, granting her the floor. "By all means." She drew a breath, carefully rehearsed, and let it out in a shaky sigh. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But maybe if we take a step back, if we try." "Spare me," Paul cut in, his tone flat. He motioned to the half-packed box near her feet. "I didn't come here for a therapy session. I came to make sure you're leaving." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The fragile performance cracked, giving way to a flash of irritation. "This isn't easy for me, Paul. Do you think this is what I wanted? To destroy everything we built?" Paul shrugged. "It's not supposed to be easy. That's what consequences feel like." The flash of anger in her eyes grew brighter. "Maybe if you'd spent half as much time on me as you did on your damn computers, none of this would have happened." He almost laughed, but his expression stayed cool, sharp. "Ah, there it is. Blame me. Classic move. But let's be honest, Sam, you didn't cheat because I was working. You cheated because you wanted to. You thought you could get away with it." Sandra sat up straighter, her voice rising. "So that's it? Years of marriage, just, gone. Because of one mistake?" Paul let out a low chuckle, dry and bitter. "One mistake? Cute. Let's count them, shall we? Months of texts. Dozens of nights at Jason's apartment. Lies stacked so high you couldn't even keep them straight anymore. That's not one mistake, Sam. That's a lifestyle." Her face twisted, the wounded innocent mask falling away to reveal raw anger. "You can't just throw me out. This is my house too." Paul reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper, crisp and neat. He held it out with a small, smug smile. "Then you might want to take this with you." Sandra frowned, snatching it from his hand. Her eyes skimmed the words, and with each line her face paled further. It was a letter. Addressed to Jason. "Dear Jason. Thanks for keeping my wife so busy these past few months. I figured you'd want to know she won't be living here anymore. Also, since I had time, I copied your wife on this note too. She found it just as interesting as I did. Best of luck explaining yourself." Sandra's hands trembled as she looked up at him, horror and fury warring on her face. You sent this? To him? To his wife?" "Oh, I sent it," Paul replied, calm as stone. "They both know everything now. Thought I'd save you the trouble of juggling your lies." Her breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. "You had no right," she shouted. Paul's smile widened, sharp and cruel. "No right? You handed me the right the moment you made me the fool in my own house. You wanted Jason. Well, now you've got him, along with his wife's wrath. Good luck with that." Sandra stood abruptly, fists clenched, her whole body shaking. "You're petty. You're vindictive. I never thought you'd stoop this low." Paul's laugh echoed coldly through the room. "Petty? No. Thorough. It's what I do for a living, Sam. I find vulnerabilities and I expose them. You were just another system with weak defenses." For once, she had no comeback. Her mouth opened, then closed again, words failing her. She sank back onto the couch, staring at the letter like it might burn a hole through her hand. Paul pointed to the boxes, his voice calm, almost bored. "Finish packing. I've done enough for you." Silence stretched heavy between them. Finally, Sandra shoved the letter into her bag, grabbed the nearest box, and stormed toward the stairs, muttering curses under her breath. Paul watched her go, expression unreadable, until the sound of footsteps faded. For the first time in years, he felt something close to control. And as the door slammed upstairs, he realized Sandra's performance had failed. The final act was over. The house was quiet in a way Paul hadn't experienced in years. Not the usual quiet of two people coexisting in separate rooms, doors closed, screens glowing, conversations muted. No, this was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, heavy and absolute, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Sandra's car had finally pulled out of the driveway 20 minutes ago, her taillights vanishing down the street like the end of a performance that had gone on too long. He hadn't watched from the window, he hadn't needed to. The sound of the engine fading into the distance was confirmation enough. She was gone. Paul stood in the living room, surveying the half-empty shelves, the boxes she'd left behind in her rush. A sweater draped over the back of the couch. A pair of heels kicked carelessly under the coffee table. Little traces of her existence scattered through the house like breadcrumbs. Proof that she had been here, and proof that she wasn't anymore. He picked up the sweater, held it for a moment, then tossed it back onto the couch with a sigh. The strangest thing was the absence of rage. He'd expected to feel it, the hot burn of betrayal, the pounding in his chest, the need to smash something, anything, to let out the poison. But instead, what he felt was, nothing. Or maybe not nothing. Maybe it was a kind of emptiness so complete it hollowed him out. It reminded him of the moments after finishing a massive project at work. Weeks of tension, hours of testing, countless sleepless nights, all leading to a final deployment. Then suddenly, it was over. The system stabilized, the alarms stopped, and all that was left was silence. Sandra had been his broken system. And now, she was offline. Paul walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The clock ticked above the stove, steady and indifferent. For the first time in months, he didn't wonder when she'd be home. He didn't care. He took a slow sip and let the thought settle, there would be no more excuses. No more fake, client dinners. No more perfume he didn't recognize lingering on her clothes. No more lies hidden behind a locked phone. The relief was subtle, almost fragile, but it was there. Yet underneath it all, another feeling lurked, an ache he couldn't quite name. He didn't miss her, not exactly. He missed the idea of her. The version of Sandra who used to laugh at his terrible jokes, who used to steal bites of pancake batter while he cooked, who used to curl against him on the couch during late-night movies. That Sandra had been gone long before Jason showed up. He realized then that what he mourned wasn't her betrayal. It was the ghost of the marriage he thought he'd had. Paul set the glass down and wandered upstairs, the weight of the day pressing into his shoulders. In their bedroom, the bed was half unmade, Sandra's side stripped bare where she'd yanked the sheets off to pack. He sat on the edge, elbows on his knees, staring at the empty space. He half expected her to come storming back in, rehearsed apology at the ready, voice cracking with crocodile tears. She was good at performances, after all. But the silence stretched on, unbroken, and Paul knew this time was different. This wasn't an argument. This was the end. And in the quiet, a strange sense of closure took root. It wasn't triumph. He hadn't won. There was no victory in discovering the woman you loved had chosen someone else, no satisfaction in dismantling a life you had spent years building together. But there was a grim finality. A door that had been creaking open for too long was finally shut. Paul lay back, staring at the ceiling, letting the emptiness wash over him. His mind wandered to possibilities he'd ignored for years, road trips he'd postponed, hobbies he'd abandoned, friends he hadn't seen because Sandra had always claimed their schedules were too full. Maybe now he'd find out who he was without her. As the minutes ticked by, the tension that had knotted his chest for months began to unravel. He wasn't happy. Not yet. But he was free. And freedom, Paul realized, was its own kind of peace. The next morning, Paul woke to sunlight streaming through half-drawn blinds. For the first time in years, the alarm hadn't been set early for Sandra's supposed work meetings. He didn't have to tiptoe around her moods, didn't have to wait for her to emerge from the bathroom with excuses on her lips and lies in her eyes. The silence, though strange, no longer felt suffocating. It felt clean. Paul dragged himself out of bed, showered, and made coffee. He poured it into his favorite mug, the one Sandra used to complain was too old and chipped. He smiled faintly as he set it on the counter. Small rebellions, he thought. Small victories. The kitchen was cluttered with reminders of her, her vitamins lined up by the sink, her collection of flavored teas taking over an entire cabinet. Paul opened the cabinet, stared at the neat rows of unopened boxes, and then began clearing them out. One by one, he tossed them into a cardboard box. He didn't have the energy for a grand purge, but he could start small. He could take control of his space, one shelf at a time. When the cabinet was finally empty, he stood back and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was just tea, but it was also more than that. It was the first piece of his life reclaimed. By mid-morning, Paul found himself wandering into the garage, staring at the dusty fishing rods leaning against the wall. He hadn't used them in years. Sandra always claimed weekends were too busy, that there were errands to run, events to attend, people to impress. Fishing had become one of those things he kept promising himself he'd get back to someday. Maybe someday had finally arrived. Paul loaded one of the rods into the back of his truck, grabbed a small cooler, and headed toward the lake 30 minutes outside town. The drive was quiet, radio off, windows cracked. He'd forgotten how much he liked the hum of tires on pavement, the way open roads seemed to stretch possibilities out in front of him. At the lake, Paul found a quiet spot near the water's edge. He cast his line, settled into the worn folding chair he kept in the truck, and exhaled. The air smelled like pine and fresh water. Birds called overhead. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore was the only background noise. For the first time in months, maybe years, Paul felt his chest unclench. He sat there for hours, catching nothing, and caring even less. It wasn't about the fish. It was about remembering who he was before Sandra's lies consumed him, about giving himself permission to exist without the weight of betrayal pressing down. By the time the sun began dipping low on the horizon, Paul felt something he hadn't felt in a long while, calm. That evening, he returned home with a small sense of accomplishment. He reheated leftovers, sat at the table alone, and didn't feel sorry for himself. Instead, he thought about what came next. The house was still filled with her fingerprints, but it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a blank canvas. Later, Paul pulled out his laptop and logged into an old social media account he hadn't touched in ages. Messages from college friends and coworkers popped up, most of them years old. He scrolled through, hesitating before typing a short update. It's been a rough season, but I'm starting fresh. Looking forward to reconnecting with old friends. He didn't expect much. But within an hour, notifications pinged. Comments from people he hadn't spoken to in forever. Invitations to grab a drink, to catch up, to go hiking. Small reminders that the world hadn't ended just because Sandra walked out. Paul closed the laptop and leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't healed. He wasn't over it. But he had taken a step forward, and that was enough. As he got ready for bed, he caught his reflection in the mirror. His face looked tired, yes, but also lighter. He almost didn't recognize the man staring back. Not the broken husband, not the betrayed partner, but someone rediscovering himself. And for the first time since Sandra's betrayal came crashing down, Paul whispered to his reflection. I'm going to be okay. 2 weeks had passed since Sandra walked out, and the silence of the house no longer felt alien. It had become routine, almost comforting. Paul had filled the emptiness with small rituals, morning coffee in his chipped mug, evenings spent fishing, and weekends sorting through old boxes, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Healing wasn't linear. Some days he woke with a sense of purpose, other days, the weight of betrayal sat heavy on his chest. But even on the bad days, he reminded himself that he was moving forward. On a quiet Saturday morning, Paul headed to the local farmer's market. He hadn't been in years. Sandra had always brushed it off as a waste of time. But Paul remembered liking the smell of fresh bread, the colors of produce, the easy rhythm of strangers milling about without urgency. As he wandered past a stand overflowing with peaches, someone bumped into him. His coffee nearly sloshed over the rim. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," a voice exclaimed. Paul turned to see a woman with dark hair pulled into a messy bun, sunglasses perched on her head, holding a basket of vegetables. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "No harm done," Paul said, steadying his cup with a small smile. She laughed lightly, a sound that felt unpracticed but genuine. "First trip here since forever, and I'm already making enemies." "Then we're both rookies," Paul replied. "I haven't been here in years." She tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "Well, you picked the right weekend. Best peaches of the season." Her name, he soon learned, was Emily. She was a graphic designer who worked from home, a single mom with a 9-year-old daughter. She had grown up in the same town but left for college, only to return a few years ago to be closer to family. They ended up walking the market together, chatting about nothing and everything. Paul was surprised at how easy it felt. There was no weight to the conversation, no hidden tension. Just two people talking, laughing about overripe tomatoes and comparing notes on which bakery stall sold the best sourdough. At one point, Emily gestured toward his fishing hat tucked under his arm. "You fish?" "Trying to get back into it," Paul said. "Used to be my weekend escape." Her eyes lit up. "My daughter loves fishing. She's terrible at it, but she thinks catching minnows is the greatest adventure in the world." Paul chuckled. "Sounds like she's got the right attitude." By the time they reached the end of the stalls, Paul felt something he hadn't expected, a spark. Not the reckless, desperate kind that comes from loneliness, but the quiet flicker of possibility. Emily scribbled her number on the back of his paper bag. "If you ever want to grab coffee, or if you feel like teaching a very impatient 9-year-old how to fish, give me a call." Paul hesitated for only a second before sliding the paper into his pocket. "I might take you up on that." When he got back to his truck, he sat for a moment, staring at the note. His first instinct was caution. He wasn't ready for anything serious. His heart was still bruised, his trust still fragile. But another thought whispered beneath the hesitation, maybe he didn't need to be ready. Maybe all he needed was to allow himself the chance to connect again. That night, Paul placed the paper on his nightstand, right where Sandra's clutter used to be. It felt symbolic, like he was leaving space for something new, something real. He didn't text Emily that night, or the next. But by the third evening, as he sat alone on the couch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he picked up his phone and typed a simple message. "About that coffee, how's Thursday?" Her reply came within minutes. "Thursday's perfect. Looking forward to it." Paul set the phone down and exhaled. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't terrify him. It intrigued him. Thursday came quicker than Paul expected. The entire day at work, he found himself glancing at the clock more than usual, his mind drifting toward the evening ahead. He had told himself this wasn't a date, just coffee with someone new. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a step, however small, into a life that wasn't defined by betrayal or suspicion. He arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, his nerves humming in a way he hadn't felt in years. He chose a corner table, ordered black coffee, and waited. When Emily walked in, balancing her bag and scanning the room, Paul felt the strangest mix of familiarity and anticipation. She spotted him and waved, her smile genuine, uncalculated. She slid into the seat across from him, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Hope you didn't wait long," she said. Not at all, Paul replied, meaning it. The conversation flowed as easily as it had at the market. They talked about work, favorite movies, small-town quirks, and her daughter's obsession with fishing. Emily had a way of listening that felt different from Sandra. There was no performance, no hidden agenda. Just attention, given freely. At one point, she leaned back, studying him. "You're easy to talk to, you know that?" Paul chuckled softly. "Most people say I'm too quiet." "Quiet isn't bad," Emily said. "Quiet means you're actually thinking before you talk. We need more of that." Paul didn't say it, but the compliment landed deeper than she probably realized. After years of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated like background noise, it felt good to be seen. When they left the cafe, Paul walked her to her car. She hesitated before getting in, then looked at him with a playful smile. "So, about that fishing lesson." He grinned. "You two bring the snacks. I'll bring the patience." She laughed, then slid into her car. "Deal. I'll text you." As her taillights disappeared down the road, Paul stood for a moment under the glow of the street lamps. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking backward. He wasn't replaying the fights, the late nights, or the hollow excuses. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Thursday afternoons at the cafe, to fishing trips that hadn't happened yet, to the possibility of laughter filling his house again. Back home, the place still bore echoes of Sandra, an empty closet here, a forgotten trinket there, but those traces no longer stung. They were just reminders of a chapter closed. The house, once suffocating in its silence, now felt like a blank page. Paul sat on the porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the quiet street. He thought about how far he'd come in such a short time. From betrayal and bitterness, to calm acceptance, to the cautious beginnings of something new. Healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about not letting it chain him down. He didn't know what would happen with Emily. Maybe it would grow into something real, or maybe it would just be a friendship. But either way, it represented movement. Life, after all, was about moving forward, not standing still. As the night deepened and crickets sang in the distance, Paul whispered something to himself he hadn't said in years. "I'll be all right." And for once, he believed it.